If Gyalmo Ngulchu could feel, Crimes Against Humanity in Driru is a comprehensive report on the situation in Driru County in eastern Tibet. The report was recently launched by the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy. Like many other parts of Tibet, where the Chinese government has been carrying out atrocities and human rights violations in all its forms for the last more than 6 decades, Driru County in eastern Tibet has been facing extreme repression, particularly for the last 10 years, making it one of the most highly controlled areas in Tibet. To understand better on why and how Driru became a focal point of repression within Tibet, we have Tenzin Dawa, Executive Director of the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy, joining us for this conversation. Welcome to Tibettv, Dawa.
Thank you for having me.
So Dawa, tell us, why has Driru become a focal point of repression by the Chinese government in the last 10 decades? And why is this situation become a matter of international concern?
So to begin with, Chimla, like you mentioned, Driru today continues to remain one of the most repressed and tightly controlled regions in Tibet, particularly within Tibet Autonomous Region. And looking into the history and the importance of that particular region, I think the Chinese government has been particularly repressive in Driru for varying reasons. And I think the first to begin with is from the perspective of environment. So Driru in particular has one of the richest biodiversity on the Tibetan plateau, meaning there is rich resources including minerals, mines, and one target for the Chinese government could be to extract those minerals from that particular region. And the second is from the historical point of view, Driru particularly because in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, we have had religious leaders from Driru and also secular leaders from that particular region who have fully sort of pledged to support, and even not only pledged but also fully supported the Chuchi Kanduk, the Tibetan voluntary guerrilla army group, by supporting military arms to fight against the Chinese occupation of Tibet during that time. And because of that, a lot of the monasteries and the secular people have been sort of become a target for the Chinese government to clamp down severely on them. And as a result of that, also we have seen a strong sense of grassroots resistance among Driru by the local Tibetans. For instance, in 2006, we saw local Tibetans in huge numbers sort of strongly supporting His Holiness the Dalai Lama's advice on completely banning animal fur, animal skin, and then burning them in Driru, and then also offering long life prayers of his services to Dalai Lama, which was again seen as an act of dissent for the Chinese government, and that also became a target for the Chinese government against the Tibetans in Driru. And then also in 2013, we saw these local Tibetans again in Driru defiantly standing up against Chinese government's national policy of hoisting Chinese national flag on their homes, right? So thousands of Tibetans, as a result of the defiant stance, has been attacked. In the same year, like I mentioned before, Driru being a resourcefully rich county in Tibet, particularly the Septa Zage and Nagla Zamba has been been illegally mined by Chinese government against the wishes of the local Tibetans. And as a form of retaliation, the local Tibetans resisted that sort of mining practice. And because of that, the government, I think more than 5,000 Tibetans were targeted at the time. And because of these reasons, we could evidently say that thousands of Tibetans in Driru, particularly within 1 year, have been systematically targeted for their strong opposition against Chinese government's very official sort of strong stance on stability maintenance policy. So under that policy, Tibetans have been fully reluctant to follow, and because of that, they had kind of become a main target for the Chinese government. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's evident in the report that Driru is a focal point, mostly because like throughout the contemporary history of China's occupation of Tibet, Driru has been a place where there has been a continuous grassroots resistance, including in the 1960s and late 1960s, where they have mobilized like about more than 3,000 people in the region and formed this Driru Lamak Garbo, so strong grassroots resistance in the region. Tell us about how the widespread and systemic attack on the Tibetan people in Driru continues today, and how these repression and repressive policies are affecting the livelihood of the Tibetan people.
So given this very serious, severe clampdown situation we saw in the last 1 decade, from 2011 to 2021, today, if you ask people from Driru who are living in exile if they have any form of contact with their family members, the majority response you would get is they have completely cut off their ties with their family members inside Tibet. And that's largely because Chinese government have criminalized any form of contact with Tibetans who are in exile, who have family members and relatives in Driru in particular. And that can be quite evident in the information that we received in 2020, when the 36-year-old Gyalmo from Driru was particularly persecuted and then tortured and then died in custody within 3 months in custody, because she was found in contact with family members in exile, and also have sent some money to her relatives in exile. So that in any sense is, first of all, is not a criminal offense. But for the Chinese government, any form of relations with outside, any sort of information that is being shared from Driru to outside has been criminalized. And also with Kuncho Jimba in 2021, who was again sentenced for 21 years in 2013, but then he passed away, unfortunately, while being in custody because of torture. He has shared some information about the situation inside Driru to outsiders, and Chinese government labeled him as a separatist and charged him of leaking state secrets. So he got sentenced and then got arbitrarily detained and then tortured and died in custody. And I think these sort of instances shows how much of a severity people living in Driru continues to face even to this day.
Right. And it equally shows China's strong sense of insecurity. So the report mentions the difficulty for the International Criminal Court, ICC, to investigate the situation in Driru particularly and in Tibet generally, for the mere fact that China is not a party to Rome Statute that has created the International Criminal Court. However, the ICC's, International Criminal Court's, lack of jurisdiction does not change the nature of the criminal offense that Chinese government has committed. And the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy claims the case here is that of crimes against humanity. What are the defining characteristics of crimes against humanity, and in what ways can we make China accountable and responsible for the offenses that it is committing?
Well, for certain acts to be considered as crimes against humanity in international law, some underlying criminal offenses has to be committed. That includes arbitrary detention, persecution, murder, torture, and extrajudicial killing. And all of that has happened in Driru in that 1 decade of repression in Driru. On top of that, to be considered, these crimes to be considered as eligible to be considered as crimes against humanity, it has to fulfill the 4 elements of the Shapao elements, which we call the Shapao elements under crimes against humanity. So basically the elements talks about these crimes that I just mentioned about arbitrary detention, torture, persecution. All of that has to be carried in first in a widespread and a systematic manner by the authorities. And the second is that it has to be targeted against the civilian population in that particular country. And the thirdly is the furtherance of the state policy, that in this sense we're talking about Chinese government's policy, right? And then the fourth is the knowledge of the attacks. Knowledge of the attacks in a sense, the authorities who are sort of accountable for carrying out these kind of atrocities have the knowledge that they are committing these kind of atrocities in that region. And when you look at the situation in Driru, all of these elements fall into place, because The attacks so far in the last 1 decade against Tibetans in Driru has been systematic in manner. It was not a random attack on Tibetans. It was done in a very strategic, carefully planned manner, and it involves a large number of Tibetans, including more than 5,000 Tibetans who were persecuted because they were Tibetan, because they resisted the Chinese government policies. And thirdly, the policy that we're talking about at the moment is the Chinese government insistence on its stability maintenance policy that they have been implementing in all over Tibet in many years. The Chinese government has been using that as a pretext to say that, we're trying to bring stability in the region, bring in developments, prosper the individuals. But on the other hand, what they're doing is really repressing any form of dissent, any form of resistance from the Tibetans living there. And the fourth is authorities we have also mentioned in the last page, in the last part of the report, who are basically responsible for committing crimes against humanity, in Driru in particular. Specifically, among the other officials, we would particularly like to highlight former party official of Tibet Autonomous Region, Tenzin Dawa, who was responsible for the series of repressive campaigns and policies, including bridge management system, convenience police stations, and voluntary village-based cadre systems. All of these policies have been instrumental in silencing Tibet Autonomous Region, including making Tibetans basically fear to speak out, let alone human rights situation. Also expressing freely has become really difficult under these kind of policies. So he was kind of the one who was responsible for carrying out these kind of policies in Tibet Autonomous Region and also in Driru. And then second, we have Wu Yingji, who was his successor as the party secretary of Tibet Autonomous Region. So these two of the public officials we would really want to see held accountable. Yeah.
That's where the report attributes these crimes against the individuals of the Chinese government. So we see there are a few recommendations and some appeal to the international community and recommendations to the Chinese government.
So for TCHRD to first of all release this report is to draw the attention, the much needed attention from the public and the international community to the credible allegations of crimes against humanity committed in Driru. And also to call upon the international governments, including civil society, and independent human rights organizations, to pressure Chinese government to allow UN independent experts to carry out independent, impartial and transparent investigations into the crimes against humanity that is committed in Driru. Our second appeal is basically to the Chinese government to ask them to end the current systematic and widespread crackdown on Tibetans in Driru and allow Tibetans in Driru to freely communicate with their family members and relatives in exile who are facing severe difficulties or psychological difficulties, living in fear and living this, always having this sense of separation from their family members. So basically we're asking Chinese government to allow them to live freely and speak freely with their family members. And thirdly, we would like to urge the international governments to pressure Chinese government to again ratify the Rome Statute, because that has been one leeway for the Chinese government to get away with the crimes that they've committed and then not be held accountable at all. So
the fact that it has ratified 6 of the 9 core, I think it's somewhere around 9, yes, 6 of the 9 core human rights treaties, including the Convention Against Torture and the cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment. And China has also, it is a signatory to United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Despite the fact that it is signatory and has ratified so many of these international conventions, there are still, like you said, leeway that where the Chinese government find an opportunity to say that, we're not part of this.
Yeah, so definitely, like you mentioned, China being signatory to a lot of these conventions, they have an obligation to uphold these principles and implement them in their own country. So we want to see a concrete pressure from the international community towards the Chinese government to, first of all, again, ratify the convention and also ratify the statute, and also to uphold their own obligations that they have been signed, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tenzin Dawa, for joining us for this conversation and for walking us through if Gyalmo Ngulchu could feel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamila.
Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy's report proves that China committed specific underlying criminal offenses for crimes against humanity. The center is examining the commission of underlying criminal offenses, namely torture, murder, detention in violation of international law, and persecution in Driru, and attributes these crimes to individual Chinese government officials. That was our today's conversation with Tenzin Dawa on if Gyalmo Ngulchu could feel crimes against humanity in Driru. See you next time.